right, so good morning, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon. Appreciate everybody's time. And Daniel, that was fabulous. Want to just make sure everybody is seeing my screen. So if someone can just let me know that everything's good. Perfect. All right. And then I do like keeping these things kind of conversational, right? Daniel, that was fabulous presentation, and thanks for leading up to that. Learned a lot because I'm not a project guy, so I appreciate that time. Hello, everybody. Like I said, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Frank. I am a senior power platform design engineer at Ameriprise. We're going to talk a little bit about environment strategies and managing risk with kind of low code, no code development, and work through what that means. So let me just get set up here to be able to go forwards and slides. There you go. So a little bit about me and my background. I am a software engineer by training, an old one at that. Not sure if all you guys are in the Twin Cities or not, but some of those names of consulting firms that I worked for back in the day might be familiar, but back in about 2003, I accidentally got put on a SharePoint project and sort of made that a career for darn near 20 years. And then Microsoft was kind enough to get rid of SharePoint 2010 workflows back a few years ago, and that pointed me down the Power Platform path. And I've been a Power Platform guy since then. So, which has been fabulous, fun, new, exciting stuff. So the Power Platform's been a great career switch, refreshed my enthusiasm for my job, and really made me want to stick with the M365 stuff again. Personal stuff. I have one bio kid and two step kids. Two of my kids graduated from high school this year. So if anybody wants to contribute to a college fund, that would be very, very much appreciated. Then kind of personal interest, boating. I coach sports, a lot of sports, and fitness. Love that. And then getting a hold of me, kind of LinkedIn, Twitter, my work email as well. And then I believe, Don, I'm going to ask you a quick question here. You're going to share out these slides after this, correct?
Yeah, we will.
Perfect. Yep, sounds good. So you don't need to write any of that down. The slides will be coming out. You can click on all that stuff. So, like I said, I like to keep these things conversational. So I'll do my best to pay attention to the meeting chat while we're going. But if you are comfortable enough to come off of mute, would love to take your questions real time as we're going. So please don't hesitate to do that. All right. So what we're going to talk a little bit today about in terms of an agenda is the type of risks we're looking at when we're managing Power Platform from a enterprise perspective, the tools available to combat those risks, which are only three really, and they all revolve around environments and creating an environment strategy, and then how specifically to use those tools to manage those risks. And again, like I said, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to stop me. So when we were thinking about rolling out Power Platform for low code, no code development at Ameriprise, we looked at risks in a couple different ways, right? Number one is development risks, right? Anytime developers are doing development, there's all kinds of risks associated with it, right? But now we are asking business users to do development as well, who have no formal training in anything around what development means. No application lifecycle management experience, no continuous integration, continuous deployment, no test-driven development. People don't understand that, right? Business users don't understand what that means. And people also don't understand the risk of like, hey, I'm developing something for my team, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make changes to the production version real time, and understanding how that affects the rest of the business if they make mistakes, right? Because we all know as software developers, if we're doing development, there are going to be bugs, and that is going to be a problem. So certainly all that kind of stuff plays into risks running into doing citizen developers doing development, and how are we going to manage that, right? Other development risks include like compliance and like legal jurisdiction laws. GDPR is a good example. How are we managing PII? Who has access to it? Where's it located? All that kind of stuff. And then the other kind of development risk that we want to manage is the scope of audience, right? Is this thing that we're building, be it a power app, be it a AI model, AI builder model, be it Power Automate, whatever it is, who's it for? Is it for just me and a couple other people? Is it for a team? Is it for a department? All that stuff matters, right? When we're the larger the scope, the more potential risk we have as we are pushing low code, no code artifacts out. One of the other risks that we have to manage is cost, right? So Power Platform, unfortunately, is not free, right? So there is standard functionality that is free with E3 and E5 licensing, right? That's the stuff that talks to the Microsoft tenant, the SharePoint, the OneDrive stuff, those kind of things. But the real interesting stuff happens when we start doing premium functionality, right? When we start talking to SQL Server, when we start talking to Amazon Web Services, when we start talking to Jira or Workday or other enterprise class software that our business uses, that all of a sudden costs money, right? And if we're talking about rack rates kind of rounded, if we've got, per user Power Apps license at $20 a month, and let's say we have a 25,000 person company, all right, so all of a sudden I'm spending $6 million a year on, on Power Apps. Or if we've got 15 dollar per user per month Power Automate license, I'm spending, $4.5 million a year. So let's say I'm, licensing everybody $10 million a year. That's not an insignificant investment for a large organization. So that just kind of, just be aware that as we're going through, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Platform in general, depending on what we're doing, we can be racking up some money. And so, like, how are we working with our finance departments and our finance people and managing that? And then the other big risk, right? One of the biggest risks for us is data exfiltration, right? So, we don't want to be in the news for having data breaches or information getting out that shouldn't be out. So when we think about Power Automate, right? So Power Automate is a workflow engine, as we all know, right? That's kind of where most of us are starting, as replacing SharePoint Designer workflows. But all of a sudden, I can let Twitter talk to Jira. I can let Twitter talk to Workday, right? So it becomes what I call a collaborative service bus, or a way for disparate systems to be able to talk to each other. And how are we managing that, right? How are we controlling that as administrators, as owners of Power Platform? That's a huge it's a huge issue for us, I assume for other people as well. So is it okay for the disparate systems to be able to talk to each other? Don't want to answer that question for you. That's up to you and your organization and your info security folks and your compliance folks. But that is a very huge issue for us as a financial organization. So those are the kind of risks that we are considering or have considered as we put together, the environment strategy and the rest of the strategies to manage this. So I'm going to take a deep breath. I tend to talk a lot and tend to talk a little fast, but just want to say, are there any questions about the kinds of risks that we see in Power Platform development from an administrative perspective before we move forward? I'll take silence as golden, but again, please, just remember, feel free to interrupt if you have any questions as we're going. All right, so what are the tools that we as Power Platform administrators have to combat these risks and deal with these risks? We have three things. We have environments that we can use, right? And we'll talk a little bit about what all these things are in a second. We have DLP policies, and DLP policies are groupings of connectors that are allowed in environments. and then licensing strategies to deal with these risks. So those are the 3 tools that I as an administrator have to help our compliance folks, our information security folks know that what they're allowing developers to do in a low code, no code scenario are safe for the organization. So what are environments? So again, I'm sure I'm assuming that most of you guys are Power Platform people and know what they are, but we'll go through them real quick just to make sure we're level setting for everybody. So containers are essentially, or environments are essentially containers for Power Platform resources. So that could be Power Apps, that could be Power Automate flows, that could be Dataverse, that could be AI builder models, anything that developers are building in Power Platform end up in an environment. With the exception of Power BI reports. Power BI reports are a little bit different, but you can kind of think if you're a Power BI person, environments are very similar to Power BI workspaces where they contain the Power BI resources and allow access, right? But a very similar concept. So the purpose of environments really are for access control, meaning who can create things within an environment, right? The people who create stuff in an environment can share it out, but the access control here is for letting the developers have access to places that they can build and share stuff out. ALM, application lifecycle management. So the process of dev, test, prod, right? So if you're a software developer from the ground up, we always think of, we have a development environment, a test environment, maybe a stage environment, and a production environment. And we build CI/CD pipelines, continuous integration, continuous development deployments. And we want to try to replicate those as much as we can for those people who know how to use them in Power Platform. And how do we do that? Well, the answer there is environments. Environments lets us do that, right? Environments also allows us to work with our compliance team to isolate data within a solution, right? So the idea here is that we can limit the number of connectors, we can limit who has access to create stuff in that environment, and then we can also on the back end control who can, or limit how many people those things can be shared with, those Power Platform and artifacts can be shared with. So the combination of compliance and connector risk reduction lets security, privacy, compliance, the powers that be, have faith that we can use Power Platform in a safe way, right? So with that kind of being said, within Power Platform, there are 5 different types of environments that we can use, right? So each and every tenant has a default environment. The default environment, just there's nothing you can do to change the fact that everyone in your tenant is an environment. So it's really interesting for those people who don't think they're using Power Platform with their organization. I would love for them to go take a look at the PPAC or Power Platform Admin Center and look at their default environment, and they can see if anything's going on, right? Because people don't necessarily turn it off. You can't really limit who has access to it. So it's really informative that you might be, as an organization, using the Power Platform Admin Center, or you might be using Power Platform and not even know it. And going to look at the default environment is the place you would go to do that. And because people don't know and everyone's a maker, that can be a very, very risky environment, right? And we'll talk about how to manage that in a second. There are trial environments that you can make once you get to that next level of just everybody using the default environment. You can use trial environments, which are great. And those can be either enterprise controlled environments or non-enterprise controlled environments through the developer environments, right? Want to be a little bit careful between trial environments and developer environments. If your company has IP related issues, people can be doing work for your company outside of your organization's boundaries, which may or may not be a issue for you. I know for us in finance, in a highly regulated industry, that is very, very dangerous. So we control that very tightly. And then there are sandbox environments and production environments. And those are the kind that we take most advantage of. Production environments are pretty clear, right? That's designed to be production data, production apps, production flows, production Dataverse, that kind of stuff. It's great because Microsoft takes care of backups and restorations and keeps the backups for 30 days, and we don't have a lot of work to do on that. Sandbox environments are a little more transient in nature. They are great. They are very similar mirror production, except for the fact that the backups aren't retained as long. So we have our lower environments as sandbox environments and our production environments as production, and you can always convert between the two. So and Ryan, yeah, thank you, Ryan. Ryan put in a link to the admin center and documentation for that. So thanks, Ryan. That's fabulous. Any questions on what environments are before I keep on moving forward? Cool. No. All right. Okay. So DLP policy. So for those of you guys who don't know, Power Platform works with different systems, SharePoint, OneDrive, whatever we want to connect to via these things called connectors. Connectors are API wrappers. I think Microsoft just announced they're up over 1,000 connectors. Like you can connect to Jira, you can connect to Twitter, like all the socials, Workday, pretty much any cloud-based service that is a kind of a enterprise class service, there's going to be a connector for it at this point, which is great. But again, we don't always want to let all the types of connectors talk to each other, right? We don't want data exfiltration. We don't want people to be able to go into Workday and tweet out time off requests, right? So in that instance, we don't want Workday to be able to talk to Twitter, right? So we limit those by defining what connectors can talk to each other. And we can do that in 3 different ways. Within a Power Platform DLP policy, there are 3 classifications that we can use. One is business, one is non-business, and one is blocked. So the blocked category for connectors is pretty self-explanatory, right? We are not going to let our end users use it. It's blocked, right? You just can't use it. It won't work. But then there's this idea of business and non-business. And both of those categories of policies within, or both those categories of connectors within a DLP policy can be used by our end users. It's just that the connectors in the business cannot be used with the connectors in the non-business. So if I wanted to let my end users be able to use Twitter and I wanted to be able to let them use Workday in our example, what we do is we put Workday in our business and we put Twitter in our non-business, and then those two can't cross-pollinate. They can't talk to each other. So with those 3 classifications, as we build out our DLP policies, we can take advantage of all those different categories to let connectors work within each other, within a group. Some can work, but not with others, and then some are blocked completely. As we set up our DLP policies, we want to make sure that we clearly think about how we're handling new connectors coming on, right? So when I started doing this, there were about 300 connectors that were available, right? As new developers roll in, we want them to be handled by our policies some way. And we can choose any one of the classifications to throw new connectors in automatically, right? So you can say, hey, I'm going to let new connectors go into business, which is a bad idea. I can let them go into non-business, which is a little bit better of an idea, or I can throw them into blocked, which is a good idea, right? Because I want to be able to evaluate those connectors as they're coming in. So we definitely want to explicitly choose how we're handling those new connectors. And then within a policy, we can say we want it to apply to all environments, multiple environments. We can exclude environments. So with all these kind of configuration settings and applications to different environments at different includes, excludes, all this stuff can get complicated really quick. So it's really good to think through this before you get started in an enterprise class solution to doing DLP policy. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're handling this here in just a few minutes. But any questions on what DLP policies are before I keep on moving along? Cool. All right. And then licensing strategy, right? So I'm not going to talk too much about licensing strategy, but again, just on, and we'll talk a little bit about how we think of it at Ameriprise in a few minutes, but just understand that like that cost, like, hey, if I licensed everybody in my company up front, I'm spending $10 million a year and needing to show ROI and all that kind of stuff. So just understand that there are different kinds of licenses for different solutions, right? So Power Apps has a per app, right? Power Apps has a per user. There's a recent addition is pay as you go. All this stuff is usable. All this stuff is you can pull that into your strategy, your licensing strategy as you go. We'll talk about how we think about it in a few minutes. But again, just understand that like licensing is a huge kind of, I would say, opportunity for shared understanding between Microsoft and us through VARs and through licensing specialists, because it gets very complicated very quickly about how to license people and how to do that efficiently and effectively through the entirety of Power Platform. All right, so kind of to the meat and potatoes of this. So using an environment strategy to mitigate all those different kinds of risks we were talking about, using those tools, right? So there's a couple of people on this call today, Ryan Stark being one of them, who kind of from Microsoft, who helped us work through all this, and we've vetted our enterprise strategy through Microsoft, and this has worked really well. So one of the things that we've done is we came up with a new concept that we call zones, right? If you look for what a zone is in Microsoft documentation, you're not going to see it. But what we did is we came up with this concept called zones. Now we've got 3 different zones that manage 3 different kinds of application developments, and they're all managed with these DLP policies that we were talked about. So the zones that we came up with are this concept of personal productivity. And personal productivity is exactly what it says, right? It is for it's Power Platform development for your own use, right? It's how am I going to manage my email? I might do flows to manage my email. I might build a little SharePoint intake form, right? It's just really my own productivity. It's stuff for me. It's stuff that if I go change, I go break, it's really not going to have an effect across a team and organization, and the entire enterprise division, anything, right? Again, very clearly my personal stuff. But at the same time, we want to allow for development for enterprise, department, enterprise, the entirety of the organization. And so as we get to shared, right, the shared zone, that is a place for low risk development, right? So typically the data source in the shared environment is the place that most people start. Typically it's SharePoint backend, maybe doing documents in a SharePoint document library, maybe connecting to a OneDrive. It really is for departmental level flows and apps. And this is where most commonly it's citizen developer or business users doing the development, people who don't have that ALM or that formal training. So that's where we run into issues of, hey, they build it, they put it out there, they made a change and they break it for everybody else who's using, or worse yet, they leave the company, it's running under their account, and all of a sudden everything stops working, right? So very, very low trained IT staff doing development that kind of spirals out of control. But we also want to allow for, they call it, it's not just low code, it's low code, no code. And we have multifunctional, cross-functional teams doing development. So we want to allow for more enterprise class development, more professionally trained business people or IT people, coders, developers to do development. So we created the secure zone, which is for higher risk development, typically higher end department level and enterprise class apps. And this is where we are really getting these power users who are more IT trained, and pro devs are the makers in these environments. This is where we allow enterprise class development to be done. We'll look at the pictures of what this looks like. I'm just kind of giving you a high level introduction here. But again, please remember that we're using those DLP policies that we talked about in the previous slide to define what the boundaries between the zones are. So that is a high level overview of what I'm about to show, but any quick questions so far? Cool. All right, we'll keep on going then. All right. Okay, so again, forgive the colors. There's a couple colors that mean a couple different things that are duplicated here. So as we can see here, we've got a picture of a bunch of circles. Down the right-hand side here, we have low risk, medium risk, high risk, and that's green, yellow, red, but it doesn't have anything to do with the green, yellow, red of these circles. So I apologize about the color scheme. I'll fix that. And if you have any questions later on, please let me know and I can send you out a new copy of the slide. But what these circles represent in this picture are power platform environments, or again, containers where people can do work, right? The green circles represent low barrier to entry, right? So we want people to be able to get into the green environments as makers very easily, right? We want them to not have to jump through a lot of hoops to do that. The yellow circles are higher barriers to entry, but not difficult, right? So we want the developers or the makers to have to do a little bit of work and interact with us a little bit in order to get artifacts in that environment. And then the red circles are higher barriers to entry, right? We want them to have to do a bit of work to get there because that's the production environments. And we want them to be relatively safe and secure and stable. And we don't want a lot of high turnover in there. So again, we'll go through this at a section by section basis. But again, in this column right here on the left, where the full vertical row of green are development environments. The middle section here are QA and test environments. And then over on the right are production environments where the end users are actually using the artifacts that were developed in the lower environments. So just understand that as we go through each one of these sections, that's kind of what this represents, right? So environments, which are where developers produce stuff, share it out, and then can make it and share it out with end users, and then end users can consume it. All right, so let's start digging into the personal and productivity environment, right? So the personal productivity environment, hang on one second here, apologies here. I just want to get my speaker notes out so I'm following along exactly with where I need to be. Thank you, there we go. Okay, so the personal productivity environment really is what we called that, or it's the environment type of that default environment, right? And like I said earlier, every tenant has a default environment, and there's absolutely nothing I as administrator can do to prevent access from every user who has a Power Platform license to use it. So how do I manage risk in that environment? How I manage risk in that environment is I limit the number of connectors that can be used in that environment. So for instance, for us, what we say is that at Ameriprise, we don't want people doing shared development. We don't want them sharing stuff out. It's really just for them to manage their own personal stuff. So what we say at Ameriprise is that in the personal productivity, you can use few and limited connectors, which equate to essentially the standard connectors of the tenant. So SharePoint, OneDrive, Outlook, right? Things that people can do with their with Power Platform to manage their own personal productivity, to simplify their lives, to automate their lives, right? There's no such thing as the deployment in the personal productivity zone, because developers can just go out there, or citizen developers can go out there and just make stuff and use it. So there's no really such thing as a deployment. It's one and only one environment. So
Hey,
again,
Frank,
oh yeah, go ahead, please.
oh,
Yeah.
just a quick question about that default personal environment. Do you
Yep.
also restrict the data sources they can connect to with those connectors?
So you can, yeah. So yes, you could potentially go into the DLP policy, right, and configure each connector to limit the data sources, right? So that's an advanced administration in DLP policies to set up endpoint configuration, that kind of stuff, right? But because we're only allowing SharePoint, we're only allowing OneDrive, we're only allowing Outlook, and we have, for us, we have conditional access policies to say that if we're using Power Platform, you have to be on our network, and we don't allow any cross-tenant communication to other. We don't federate to any other tenants. So for us, what we're saying is you can only use our SharePoint. You can only use our OneDrive for Business. You can only use our Outlook Exchange, right? So we are limiting in that environment just to our internal tenant. So for all intents and purposes, the answer to your question is yes, we can limit that. But we do that by using a conditional access policy that says you can only use our internal stuff. So did that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, yes, it did. Thank you.
Cool. Yep. But there are other tenants, like there are other things like we talked about earlier, where for instance, and I believe Jason, it was you who asked that question, right? So there's other connectors like the HTTP connector, right? Which is a more generic connector that lets you make REST calls or API calls, right? If you're using something like that, right, that's a little bit more open, then you would want to whitelist or allow endpoints and disallow other endpoints, right? So going into those connector configurations within the DLP policy, the tools are absolutely in place to allow exactly what you're talking about. So cool. Thanks for the question, Jason. That was fabulous. Cool. All right. So the other thing that we don't want people to do in our personal productivity is create multi-user apps, right? So we have a governance policy to disallow sharing of apps in the personal productivity zone. And there are two different ways to do that. Number one is a reactive way, and the other one is a proactive way, right? So the reactive way to do that is using something called the Power Platform Center of Excellence Starter Kit, the COE Starter Kit, which is built by the Microsoft PowerCat team and is downloaded in a separate install. It is a fabulous tool for us administrators to help manage that. So if you guys have not done that, or if you guys are on the administration side and are not using the Power Platform COE Starter Kit, highly recommend. It's a little bit of a pain to set up. It's getting better and better to do. They're building in more wizard-based installs, so it's a little bit less painful than what we did a couple years ago. But within that, you can see by app how many people it's shared with and that kind of stuff. So you can reactively manage that. There's also something in Power Platform called managed environments. Managed environments lets you set sharing policies. The problem with using managed environments in something like a personal productivity environment is every solution in there needs to be premium licensed, meaning we drive up costs. So there's a balancing act there of managing costs versus versus reactive management and proactive management. And for us, reactive management is good enough. But again, remember that we say personal productivity is just for the users that for their own personal stuff. So we reactively manage and we go talk to people who share stuff off. So that's how we manage that. Again, let me get to the next slide here. So again, this is the talking points of what we just talked about. So the personal productivity is low risk personal management. Default environment type, everyone is maker, no deployments. We have few and limited connectors, and then governance of no shared apps or flows, and the proactive management through the managed environments and the reactive management through the COE starter kit, right? All that makes sense. I know Jason had that question. Any other questions before I start talking about shared zone? Cool. All right. So shared zone, again, is for medium risk development or kind of business users who want to do development for their team or their department, right? That's the kind of thing we're talking about here is team and department level stuff. And we think of it for us in two different ways. Number one is we have something called shared direct prod, and that's this upper circle right here, right? So shared direct prod for us is a lot like the personal productivity zone in the personal productivity environment, and that's one and only one environment. But what we've done is we've said, we want you to do your shared development here in the shared zone. And if you're a business user, what we've discovered is that asking business users to understand ALM or doing development in a development environment, have to do a deployment to a test environment and then another deployment to a production environment is overwhelming, and it became a barrier to entry. So what we did is we gave our business users the option to opt into, I am going to go build my Power Platform stuff directly in a production environment, but they have to sign off at the beginning that they built it. If they break it, it's on them, not us to fix, right? So we are being very, very clear that they own the development, they own the maintenance, they own the stability of the artifacts that they're building. If they want to go in to just build it in production, they can, but we explain to them that's a higher risk. If they're sophisticated enough that they understand what doing the benefits of having a dev, a test, a prod copy are, we give them that option. And in the shared zone, right, we will give the project teams or the people doing development a development environment for them to use, right? So project one comes and says, yep, we want ALM, we want to have a production copy and be able to make ongoing changes. We understand what that means. So what we would do is we would give them their own development environment to do the work, right? In that development environment, the developers are makers and basically just shy of system administrators. So they can do Dataverse, they can do Power Apps, they can do Power Automate, whatever they want to do, they want to build, they can do that. We control that via Active Directory groups. Once they do their development, they will say, we are now ready to promote that artifact to a test environment, right? So what they would do is they'd export that solution. We would import that solution to a test environment. And that's where we're trying to mimic a real from the ground up CI/CD ALM environment. So once they hand us off the solution, we import it into the test environment. We no longer let the makers have access to make changes. We treat that now as source, as binary. The developers are just users in that environment that have access to the solution that we deployed, as are the testers, right? So those are the two groups of people who have access in the test environment. And then we can complete a dev test cycle here with true ALM, right? In the shared environment, as you can see, we have multiple projects hitting the exact same test environment. And the reason we can do that is because the connector configuration of the DLP policy is consistent across the entire zone. So the way we kind of think about it, the DLP policy in our shared zone has the exact same connectors that are in the personal productivity zone. So the SharePoints, the OneDrives, the Outlook, whatever else we allow, plus any other softwares or services. To Daniel's point earlier, project is one of those that is allowed and okay to use for the entire organization. Our compliance, our security, our privacy has said, yes, these connectors can be used by everybody at the organization as is without us needing to approve it. So we've worked with our security, privacy, compliance to get those approved. So our DLP policy in that shared zone, again, is the personal productivity connectors plus any other globally approved connectors. So by having that done, and it's just one and only one DLP policy, the artifacts can be deployed to the test production, to the single test environment. Once that ALM cycle is complete, we then deploy those artifacts to the production environment, where not only are the developers makers, the testers are makers, or sorry, the developers are users, the testers are users. We can also then share out with the end users that the developers have built the project for. So we're very much mimicking here a traditional CI/CD pipeline, a little bit of manual intervention at this point, of course, but still dev test prod or direct prod. So again, still very low risk development. Again, we're not really doing enterprise class development here. We're doing kind of team department level apps. And we're supporting the fact that if a business user doesn't have any IT training, they're satisfied with a little bit higher risk on their part. Or if it's more power user driven development and they have a handle on understanding, again, dev, test, and prod copies and be able to enhance a product while there's a production copy, we can support that here in the shared environment. So this slide, hang on, I'm moving multiple slides at the same time here. So this slide talks about that, right? So the two flavors here are the shared direct prod, ALM support. The dev environment is sandbox for us. QA is sandbox, production is production. Direct prod, anyone can be a maker upon request. Dev environments really are controlled access. The AD group of developers are essentially makers in that environment, can do anything. in prod, in pest and prod, only the admins are makers. We deploy the solutions. In terms of deployments, direct prod, there are no deployments because stuff is just built in prod. ALM is supported in this part of the picture right here. And then we've got the DLP strategy here of the personal productivity connectors, plus any other standard connectors that have been approved for your organization. And it's a single policy that manages the entire zone. So all that makes sense. Any questions, comments, concerns? I'll take a deep breath at this point. So any questions yet?
There was something way back there, Frank. Brian Call was asking about when you were talking about getting an agreement with or talking to the end users who wanted to have access to things, right?
Yep.
About getting an agreement from each person that creates something then. So how are you guys handling that part of the governance piece? Are you getting them and saying, hey, we agree to these terms, and hence you get, how does that process work for you guys?
Sure. So for us, so let me go back to the picture here for a second so I can do that, right? Okay, so when we're down in the ALM supported part of this, right? That question's a little bit irrelevant because typically we talk to them about the fact that they're going to have 3 environments. They only have access to this environment, and we will share to this, right? For us, the way we handle that is that the shared direct prod is an opt-in controlled by an Active Directory group, right? And again, this part of our process needs a little bit of maturity. I'll say that up front, right? So another person on the call, Mike Bell, and I are the owners of that Active Directory group. So as people request access to that Active Directory group, and we've got a ServiceNow Active Directory process that gets added, so they can click and add themselves to an Active Directory group. We have to approve it, right? So it's not auto approval. At that point, we know who is requesting access to that environment, and it is a trigger for us to have that conversation, right? If we wanted to, in other ways we've handled that within our organization, is that we've built custom ServiceNow forms. That's our tool of choice for this kind of stuff, that has terms and conditions built in. So what we could do, and we will do, is have a special request form for that Active Directory group saying, I understand that stuff I build here is being built directly in prod, and that any changes I make could affect production processes, right? Again, the wording would need to be wordsmithed and all that kind of stuff. But right now it's conversational. Right now it's just documented in a site that we have that talks about everything Power Platform. But at the end of the day, once our process around that matures a little bit, we'll have a terms and conditions page about getting access to that direct prod environment. And then it's an opt-in, right? Then it's opt-in for the end users. They can choose whether they want to go to direct prod or this shared environment down here. Did that answer your, and Brian, did that answer your question?
Hey, Frank.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
There's a lot of questions that have come up with this, and
sure.
We are starting our governance as far as our platform and everything goes. We've been pretty engaged on, citizen developers and create your own. And then it comes into the question of, when to use a service account versus just your own account.
Yep.
But today, the way that it stands is you create it, you develop it. If you want support, then you have to actually go through, a request and everything. Then there's documentation and a handoff and so on. In your situation, if I were to create something, and at some point, I'm the citizen developer. It's going to go into production eventually. So I'm happy with it. I've created it. I'm ready to now move this into QA. I
Yep.
then reach out to your team
Yep.
and export it to you, and then you build it again, or
There's a lot of answers to that question. Hey, Brian, I'm going to answer your question. So Don, so just on air production meeting, Don, if it's okay, if I go over a couple minutes, are we okay with that? Like
Yes.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
So, okay,
No,
perfect. Okay.
no, we're good. Thank you.
Sounds good. Okay, just want to make sure. So the ALM is interesting in Power Platform, right? And I was going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. There are a couple ways to handle ALM, right? You can use Azure DevOps, right? The traditional Azure DevOps that pro devs have been using for a long time to deploy solutions from environment to environment, right? I don't want to say that's necessarily trivial to set up, but there are a lot of help templates that the Azure DevOps team and the Power Platform team has built, and there's a lot of stuff out there to be had and found, right? When we get to the and so to your point, Brian, for us, the way we're managing this right now, we don't have a lot of this kind of work, right? We don't have a lot of shared development. We have a lot more direct prod work. We don't have a lot of this in our environment, even though we have about 30,000 users. So I jokingly say I am the automation. So I help people in that situation. What they do is they export a solution, and then there's an import wizard in the next environment. Importing stuff is fairly trivial. The first time takes a little bit of time because you got to reset up the connections. Not that hard. So the way I usually do that within my organization is I do a screen share with the people I'm doing the imports for. I import it, usually takes a couple minutes. I have them take over my screen, enter their service accounts, enter their passwords, all that kind of stuff. I don't want to manage passwords for them. Once that's set up the first time, it's set up from the future on. So future deployments become easier. But yeah, the first time to set up a solution in a new environment's a bit of a pain because of that. But that honestly is not taking a lot of my time. It's relatively trivial because there's not a lot of stuff in that environment. When we get down to the secure environment, we'll talk a little bit about managed environments at a high level. In managed environments, which is relatively new for Power Platform, but it's a godsend, they've built in deployment pipelines in the environment. So that makes ALM a ton easier. And then Brian, reach out. The high level to your question is, when should people using service accounts rather than their own accounts? The best practice answer to that is always. Because again, remember that if people leave the organization, stuff is going to stop working, right? That's essentially what it comes down to. So the earlier you can incorporate service accounts into your process, once people are doing real development, the better off you're going to be. But again, I don't want to get too far afield, but my contact information is in the slide deck that they're going to show. Feel free to contact me, and we can or go to LinkedIn and contact me, and we can totally have that conversation at any point. And maybe we can even do, a development best practice solution or presentation later at some other point in time in the future. But for the short term, Brian, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thanks. And I'll hit you up on that because I got a lot of questions related to this.
Perfect. That's fabulous. So love having those conversations. Before I move on, and I'll speed up kind of quick here, but we've been through the meat of it here pretty quick. But any other questions before I move on?
Nothing in the chat. I think you're good, Frank.
Excellent. Lovely. All right. Thank you. All right. So we'll keep on going here. Okay. So now, this is that shared environment again. Okay. So now, here's where things get interesting, right? So in secure development for us at Ameriprise, right? We've got five triggers that for us increase risk, right? So for us, It's really about data. It's not necessarily about scope, but scope is a huge issue. And by scope, I mean, is it for department? Is it for team? Is it for corporation? But for us, it's really about, is it going to generate cost through premium functionality? Is it going to have personally identifiable information? Is there a business justification for globally unapproved connectors? And that HTTP connector that I mentioned earlier is one, right? So there's a lot of reasons to use the HTTP connector in a variety of scenarios, right? The COE starter kit being one of them, child flows being one of them. You need it for a lot of stuff, but it's not something you want out in the wild uncontrolled. So we mitigate that risk by moving it down to the secure zone. If we're coming back to on-premise data through the data gateway, that increased risk for us. Or if we're using custom connectors, which let you talk to on-premise API, that's another thing for us. So again, I'm not going to repeat those, but there's a lot of factors that trigger more risky development. And for that, what we do is we get down to the secure zone, which has higher level of security. So again, relatively easy to give people a development environment, right? So we're not far afield from there, right? We can give people the development environment, let the developers start doing their stuff in that zone, but we are injecting ourselves. Oh, sorry. So one thing before I get in there, we are not allowing direct to prod development in the secure zone, right? The development is risky enough that we are requiring them to go through ALM. This is, like I said, where enterprise class development is happening, and because of that, each environment or each team building an app or department building a set of apps is getting their own triad of environments. They're getting their own development environment, they're getting their own test environment, and they're getting their own production environment. And more importantly, they're getting their own DLP policy that supports that. So we've got at this point dozens of secure triads, meaning we've got dozens of secure projects, teams doing a set of projects, and each one of those has their own dev, their own test, their own prod, right? And the way this works is because it's riskier, we are increasingly making it tougher and tougher to get to higher environments, right? So what we're calling this in this picture is a review stage gate, right? So a development team is developing their project, which is easy to get them started doing. Their just go do your development. When you're ready to do deployment, we're injecting ourselves with a review stage gate. What is a review stage gate? That is going to be different for every organization, right? For us, that is working with our security team saying, security, are you aware this is going on? Are you okay with this kind of development? We're exporting the code as unmanaged and we're doing, all the security scans, right? Compliance is engaged in making sure that like the connectors that they're using is okay, right? So there's a process, a review process, a stage gate before they get from dev to test, right? So they'll request a secure deployment that will kick off a set of review processes. Once we've got that review processes, then we'll deploy to test, right? Great. We do this dev test cycle. We only require the review process for the first deployment to test, right? Things change over time. Project requirements change. Bug fixes change the way code is implemented, all that kind of stuff, right? We are not making them go through a review between each and every deployment. However, what we are doing once they do finish the dev test cycle, right? We're doing another review before they move into production, right? So the way to think about it is before the first deployment to a higher environment for each development effort, we are requiring that stage gate review check. And again, that could be different for whatever your organization needs, right? For us, again, security, privacy, compliance, all that kind of stuff. Yours might be different. I don't know, but that's how we're building this in here, right? And then the other thing that we're doing and the other thing that we're talking to our organization with is for each major revision, which includes, for us, we're defining major revision as the addition of a connector or the addition of personally identifiable information. If they're doing minor revisions, which are just bug fix enhancements, we're not requiring those checks, but if they're adding connectors or changing the data that's involved in the app, we're re-requiring those checks. So we're purposefully slowing down the development a little bit. That's kind of why I'm saying here, this is typically more your professional development group. We're slowing it down because there's more risk. If there's higher visibility to who in the organization, there's higher risk of the kinds of data. There's just more risky stuff going in. So that's why we're slowing it down. This next slide, oh, hang on, I changed in the wrong screen. We'll go to the slide right here. So this slide again talks about the words of everything we just explained. For us, it's the 5 triggers. If you notice in here, it's not scope of application, though a lot of people do include scope of application in that. The talks again about the types of environments for each one of the dev, test, QA, who are the makers. ALM is supported, and again, I can't remember who asked the question. I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but again, ALM is supported and required. We can do that via Azure DevOps, which is pretty complicated. Managed environments now has this built in, which is fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. Thank you, Microsoft, for doing that. I can set up a deployment pipeline. That way I don't have to do that for them. The developers can request a deployment. Stage gate checks can be built in that pipeline. They need approvals before it moves to the next stage. All that can happen automatically. And again, managing risk. Each DLP policy, each triad gets its own DLP policy. So any questions on that before I move on? Because I know I'm running a slight bit behind. Any questions real quick before I keep going?
Now, there was one, but I don't know if you even know about this. This might be maybe some Microsoft people, maybe other people.
I can answer this question.
Okay, perfect.
So this one available E5 licensing. Regarding so we need to be careful about what DLP means here, right? So so Jason, DLP policy in terms of Power Platform is not what you think of as DLP policy, right? So with Purview, there are different kinds of DLP policies that you can set up to work over Exchange, SharePoint, those kind of things. That is really truly what a DLP policy is, right? In terms of Power Platform, if we go back to the slide, hang on, let me get to that slide right here. Power Apps. So DLP policies, again, for Power Platform are really just groupings of connectors that can be used together and then applied to an environment, right? So the kinds of DLP policies that you're talking about in your question are more like the Purview policies, and I believe there is E5. I'm saying that kind of questionably. Like, I think there are E5 required to use some of those Purview DLP policies. So the answer to that question is I believe that's right. But again, those are different than Power Platform environment policies, which again, I wish they were named something else. They are just named DLP policies in terms of Power Platform. It's very unfortunate, but hopefully that answered your question. Okay, cool. Anything else before I move on real quick? Cool.
Nope. Go ahead.
All right, cool. All right. So the secure zone, the words, quick do's and don'ts. Again, this is I'm sending out the slide deck. So for time information, you guys can read through this. There's not anything surprising to this for admins. For Brian's question that he asked before, please use service accounts as people are doing development. That will save you as an admin a lot of pain later on. Let me make sure I'm here and can move forward. Okay, so DLP policy, we talked a lot about this. It goes hand in hand with the environment strategy, the personal productivity zone, few and limited connectors, shared zone, personal productivity connectors, plus other globally approved connectors, secure zone, case by case basis. And then the new connector handling, highly recommend block. I could see a case for non-business, but please don't let new connectors go directly to business. That'll open you up for a world of hurt later on in terms of actual data exfiltration. So you probably don't want to do that. Licensing strategy. The licensing strategy, it really only manages that cost, right? And the way we handle licensing strategy at Ameriprise, for us, we've decided predictability is a more important value or requirement than saving money, right? So we don't use the per app or the pay-as-you-go system. We license people, right? It's a little bit more expensive way to do it, but by licensing people, I can tell my finance people or my finance team how much I'm going to spend, and that was their value that they wanted from us. Within that predictability or licensing people, not flows, not apps, there's two ways to do it. You can either license everybody up front, which generates that big spend, or on demand, and that's the way we do it. So as people build these premium solutions, we license them on demand via AD group licensing. We don't start getting charged until they request a license. Where that falls down a little bit is if people share an app with 250 people, I have to add 250 people to an Active Directory group, which is a little bit of a pain in the butt. But again, at the same time, just please realize that you have choices. My point of talking through this is realize you have choices about how you license them, how you license your end users. You just need to work through with your end user, with your finance department, how you want to do that and what's important to them, and then gather ROI information on the way to justify the spend. And that's kind of it at a high level. I know I went through those last slides kind of fast, but the real point was that environment strategy piece of that. Thank you guys very much for your time today. Again, thank you, Michelle and Don, for letting me come talk to you guys. But I'll throw the platform, I'll pull up, let me get to the right picture here. Oh, there we go. There we go. I'll throw that open and just throw it up and see if anybody has any questions before I turn it over back to Don and Michelle.
Hey, Frank, I just had one more quick question.
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead.
From the standpoint of how your team's structured and how big your company is, it
Yep.
sounds like this is a pretty complicated, I don't want to call it process, but just
Yep.
management of the environments,
Yep.
executing the COE stuff, all that kind of thing. So do you have a dedicated team that this is mainly what they do? Like this is their focus?
So Jason, that's a fabulous question. And if you're going to manage Power Platform development at scale, I'm just going to say you have to, right? You have to have that. In most organizations, including ours, it evolves out of a SharePoint team, right? So typically, Power Platform is brought into an organization because people want to build against SharePoint, right? And then it quickly evolves with like, oh, hey, there's a SQL Server connector. I want to start using on-prem SQL to do that, right? That's how it evolves. But in terms of building and embracing Power Platform development as a whole, it needs to evolve into its own team because there's just enough there, right? And there is a Microsoft maturity model built for managing Power Platform, right? And that level that you're it's level 100 through 500 or level 1 through 5, right? Why it's 100 and 500, I don't know, but like you're talking about, like the fact that it's just kind of happening is level 100, right? And building out a team and a COE starter kit and how you're doing support evolves that maturity down to a level 500 or very, very advanced processes. And then it goes against different dimensions. So I highly recommend looking at that. And I'll try and find a link to that, or maybe Ryan Stark, I know you're on the call. If you have the link to that maturity model, if you could post that in the chat, that'd be fabulous. And I know Ryan's a Microsoft guy, so he might have that. But yeah, we run it with a small team, Jason. So we're an organization of 30,000 users. We've got a technical manager and 2 engineers managing Power Platform for the team of, or for the organization of, 30,000. We've got about 5,000 flows and about 2,000 Power Apps as an organization. We can manage that using the COE starter kit and managed environments, all that kind of stuff. Like I said, with a relatively small team, but yes, we're dedicated to Power Platform exclusively.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem. And then my colleague Mike Bell, who's the technical manager, just sent the link to that, Jason. It's in the meeting chat. So, Don, again, thank you guys. Thank you, Michelle and Don, for the opportunity. Really appreciate it. And it's a lot of fun today. I really appreciate it.